The champagne glass was still in her hand when she said his name like a joke the whole room was supposed to laugh at. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He only asked her one question, the same question her grandmother had warned her, 8 years before, never to make a man answer in public. By the time the room fell silent, Adiz did not know that the man she had just humiliated already knew exactly how this night would end. Before we go further, if stories of quiet endurance and long-overdue justice keep you here past midnight, subscribe, tap the bell, and share this with someone who still believes patience outlives pride. Now, back to Lagos, 8 years ago. Lagos does not forget a wedding. Not the loud ones, not the ones where the compound overflows into the street and the generator strains under the weight of speakers. And it did not forget the wedding of Daniel Okonkwo and Adiz Chukwuma, because it was at that wedding that Daniel's grandmother, Eneni Ifoma, old enough that people had stopped counting her years, stood in front of 2 families and said a thing nobody wrote down, but everybody remembered. She said, "The hand that lifts a person up in front of others must never be the hand that strikes them down in front of others. Break that law, and whatever you tear down in public will rebuild itself against you." People laughed, a little nervously, the way people laugh at old women who say true things at happy occasions. Adiz laughed too. She was 26 then, sharp-eyed, hungry for a life bigger than the one her father's failing transport business could give her. And she loved Daniel the way you love a raft when you are drowning desperately, and without asking whether it can hold your weight forever. Daniel was 29. He drove a rented car to his own wedding because the one he had was in the shop, and he told this to no one because he believed a man's struggles were his own business, not a performance. He worked in logistics, the unglamorous kind, tracking containers, chasing payments, solving other people's supply chain disasters at 2 in the morning. He was not rich. He was reliable, which is a different, quieter, less photographed kind of wealth. For 3 years, this was enough. Then it stopped being enough. Adiz's father's transport business collapsed the way businesses collapse in Lagos, not with an explosion, but with a slow leak. Trucks repossessed one at a time. Debts that multiplied faster than the family could shrink them. And in the middle of that collapse, something happened that Adiz never knew about. Something that would not surface for 8 more years. An anonymous investor quietly paid off the largest of her father's outstanding debts, on the condition that his name never be attached to it. Nobody told Adiz this. Not her father, who accepted the money out of desperation and signed away his silence along with his gratitude. Not the lawyer who arranged it. And certainly not Daniel, who made the transfer from an account Adiz had never once looked into. Because in a marriage built on hunger and ambition, some things are easier to hide than to explain. He did it not because the marriage was thriving. It was not. He did it because Eneni Ifoma's words had lodged themselves somewhere in him, and because he had made his own private vow, separate from any wedding oath, that whatever happened between him and Adiz, he would not be the reason her family drowned. The marriage ended a year later anyway, quietly on paper, in a lawyer's office with fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. Adiz filed. She said the word ambitious, like it was an insult aimed at herself, as though she were furious with the version of her that had once settled for a man who drove borrowed cars. Daniel signed without contest. He asked for nothing. He left with 2 suitcases and the debt of a small logistics loan he had co-signed years earlier and never told her about either. 8 years is a long silence, long enough to become 2 different people entirely. And somewhere in that silence, a debt that neither of them remembered, a promise older than their marriage, older than their divorce, was still quietly, patiently coming due. Neither of them knew it yet, but some promises do not need to be remembered to be kept. They only need time. By the time 8 years had passed, Adiz Chukwuma was no longer the daughter of a failing transport man. She was Adiz Bello Chukwuma, co-founder of a logistics tech company called Swiftrail, the kind of Lagos success story that gets written up in glossy business magazines with headlines about disrupting the supply chain. She wore the 8 years like a new skin, designer, tailored, expensive. She had rebuilt her father's shattered empire into something sleeker and more modern than he ever imagined, and she had done it, in her own telling, entirely alone. This was not quite true, but it was the story she told, and after enough years, people begin to believe the stories they tell about themselves more than they believe the truth. Daniel, in those same 8 years, had built something smaller and far less photographed. He ran a modest freight consultancy out of a 2-room office in Yaba, 3 employees, one loyal client base built slowly on the unglamorous virtue of never once missing a delivery deadline. He drove his own car now, an older one, paid off. He had not remarried. He had, in the words of his sister Ijoma, gone quiet in a way that worried people who loved noise. What almost no one knew, not his sister, not his 3 employees, not a single soul outside one very discreet law firm, was that 3 years after the divorce, Daniel had made a second, larger, entirely anonymous investment. This time not to save Adi's father, but to save Swiftrail itself, in its most desperate hour, when a shipment scandal nearly bankrupted the company Adi's had poured her whole rebuilt life into. He had structured it through a shell entity with a name that meant nothing to anyone, Akonta Capital Partners. He had never met the lawyers who managed it face to face. He had never told a single person why he did it. Why does a man save twice the empire of a woman who left him without a fight? This is the unanswered question sitting at the center of this story, and it does not resolve here. Hold on to it. The night that would humiliate Daniel in front of 200 strangers began, as these things often do, with an invitation he almost declined. Swiftrail was hosting its 5-year anniversary gala at a hotel on Victoria Island, the kind of event with a step and repeat banner and photographers paid to make everyone look more important than they felt. Daniel's small consultancy had, through 3 degrees of business coincidence, become a minor logistics partner on one of Swiftrail's newer freight corridors. A fact Adiz did not know, because she had long ago stopped reading the small print of contracts her operations team signed on her behalf. His invitation came not from her but from a junior operations manager who thought Mr. Okonkwo from the freight side deserved a seat for a job well done. Daniel almost said no. Then he thought of Nneni Ifoma, 3 years gone now, and the strange comfort of showing up somewhere without needing anyone's permission to belong. He said yes. He did not know Adiz would be standing 40 feet away in a red dress, laughing at a joke her fiancé, a real estate developer named Tund Adami, had just made about small logistics guys who never made it big. He did not know that this joke, in about 4 hours, would have his own name attached to it, spoken by his ex-wife in front of everyone. The gala had not even started, and already 3 secrets were sitting in the same room, unaware of one another, waiting for the wrong moment to collide. There is a particular cruelty that only surfaces around people who once loved us, a precision that strangers cannot manage, because strangers do not know exactly where the old wounds are. Adiz saw Daniel across the room at nearly 9 o'clock, an hour into the gala, and something in her chest did 3 things at once. It recognized him, it recoiled from him, and though she would never admit this, not even to herself, it felt, for half a second, the ghost of something warmer than either recognition or recoil. She crushed the 3rd feeling before it could finish forming. She had gotten very good in 8 years at crushing feelings before they finished forming. She crossed the room with her champagne glass, held like a small weapon. "Daniel," she said, and her voice carried the particular brightness people use when they want an insult to sound like hospitality. "I didn't know Swiftrail still worked with, what do you call it now? Small operations." A few nearby guests laughed the polite laugh of people who don't understand the joke, but recognize its shape. Daniel said nothing yet. This was, as those who knew him understood, always the most dangerous part of him, not his anger, which he rarely showed, but his silence, which he never rushed. Adiz, mistaking silence for defeat, kept going. This is the first mistake of the three that would define her that night, mistaking a quiet man for a small one. "You know," she said, louder now, angling her voice toward Tund and two of his investor friends, "Daniel used to tell me logistics was a business of patience, not scale. I always thought that was such a beautiful way of saying, I will never be ambitious enough for either of us." The laughter this time was less polite and more real, because cruelty delivered elegantly is, to a certain kind of room, entertainment. Foreshadow, held for later. Somewhere in that laughing crowd stood a woman named Bissy Faletti, Swiftrill's chief financial officer, the only person in the company besides two external lawyers who had ever seen the real ownership documents behind Akonta Capital Partners. She was not laughing. She was watching Daniel's face with the particular stillness of someone who knows a landmine is buried nearby and is waiting to see who steps on it. Daniel set down his own glass. "Adiz," he said evenly, "you've built something impressive, I mean that." "I built it alone," she said, and here was her second mistake, not cruelty this time, but pride, the older and more dangerous sin, the one Nne Ifoma's oath had actually been written to punish. Every brick of it. No one carried me. Not my father's old friends, not some anonymous savior, no one. I did this with my own two hands, unlike some people, who are still explaining to strangers what freight consultancy even means. Tund laughed loudest of all, the laugh of a man secure enough in his fiancée's success to enjoy watching someone else's shrink. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked the one question. The question this story opened with. The question Nne Ifoma had, without knowing it, taught him to save for exactly this kind of night. "Adiz," he said quietly, "do you actually know where the money came from the year your father's trucks were about to be repossessed? The year before we divorced?" The room did not go silent immediately. It took Tund a second to stop laughing. It took Bissy Faletti exactly 1 second to set down her own glass and step half a pace closer, because she, alone among 200 guests, understood precisely what question had just been asked, and precisely how large the answer was. Adiz opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time that night, that she did not actually have one. Silence in a crowded room is not truly silence. It is 200 people deciding, all at once, whether to keep pretending they aren't listening. "What are you talking about?" Adiz said, and her bright, weaponized voice had gone thinner, the way voices do when the person speaking senses the ground shifting beneath a conversation they thought they controlled. "Nothing," Daniel said. "Forget I asked." This was the third and final mistake of the night, though it was Daniel's, not Adiz's, and it was a mistake in the old folktale sense. The hero who, having been given the chance to walk away with dignity intact for both parties, instead plants one seed of doubt too many and finds it grows a tree neither of them can control. Because Bissy Faletti, watching from 6 feet away, made a decision in that instant that would detonate everything by morning. She pulled out her phone, walked quietly toward the terrace doors, and typed a message to Swiftrill's external legal counsel. "Need the Akonta Capital ownership file pulled by tomorrow morning. Someone at the gala just said something that shouldn't have been sayable unless he knew." Adiz, unaware of this message, unaware of anything except the sudden cold feeling that she had walked into water deeper than she'd measured, laughed once, short and unconvincing. "You're being strange, Daniel. As usual." "As usual," Daniel repeated, and there was no anger in it, which somehow made it worse. He picked his glass back up. "Congratulations again on 5 years. Genuinely." And he turned and walked toward the exit, past photographers who did not know his name, past a step and repeat banner that would never feature him, out into the ordinary Lagos night, where his old, paid-off car waited exactly where he had left it. He did not see Adiz standing very still for almost a full minute after he left, her champagne gone warm in her hand, a single sentence turning over and over in her head like a stone she couldn't stop touching to check if it was sharp. "Do you actually know where the money came from?" She did not sleep that night. Tund asked her twice what was wrong, and twice she said nothing, which is what people say when the true answer is too large to fit into a bedroom conversation at 1 in the morning. By sunrise, Bissy Faletti's message had already been answered. The lawyers had found the file, and what it contained was about to turn a private humiliation from a gala into a public reckoning that neither Adiz nor Daniel had ever meant to invite into daylight. Here is what the ownership file said, in the flat, unpoetic language of legal documents, the kind of language that somehow makes the most enormous revelations sound like tax paperwork. Akonta Capital Partners, the entity that had quietly injected 40 million naira into Swiftrail during its near collapse 3 years earlier. The entity Adiz's own board had thanked in a private memo as our most patient and least demanding investor, was, and had always been, a single-member holding company. Its sole beneficial owner, listed in a clause so dry it took the lawyer reading it aloud twice to register its weight, was one Daniel Chibuike Okonkwo. Bissy Faletti read this at 6:40 in the morning, alone in her home office, and set the printout down very slowly, the way you set down something that has suddenly gotten heavier than it looked. This is the moment the story's true shape reveals itself, and it is worth pausing on, because up to now, this has looked like a story about a bitter divorce and a cruel comment at a party. It is not that story. It never was. It is the story of a man who, twice in 8 years, quietly rebuilt the fortunes of a family that had wronged him. Not for credit, not for reconciliation, not even as far as anyone could tell, for the private satisfaction of being secretly indispensable. He had done it and said nothing. He had let his ex-wife stand in a ballroom and tell 200 people she had built her empire with her own 2 hands, alone, unaided, while the largest single act of aid her empire had ever received sat quietly in his name, in a file almost no one had reason to open. Why? The question the story asked at its outset returns here sharper. Why does a man protect, in total secrecy, the success of the very people who discarded him? The answer, when it finally comes, will not be the answer either the audience or Adiz expects. It will not be love, at least not the simple kind. It will not be revenge either, though revenge is what Adiz, once she learns the truth, will fear the most. It will be something closer to what Nneni Ifoma tried to teach a room full of laughing wedding guests 8 years earlier, that some people build their whole character around a single, unglamorous idea, that dignity is not what other people give you, but what you refuse to stop giving, even to people who no longer deserve it from you. But Adiz does not know any of this yet. At 7 o'clock that morning, all she knows is that Bissy Faletti has asked for an emergency meeting, and that her voice on the phone sounded like someone delivering news about a death. She walked into that meeting expecting a funding crisis. She was about to learn that the crisis was her own understanding of the last 8 years of her life. The boardroom at Swiftrail's headquarters had glass walls, which Adiz had chosen years ago because she liked the symbolism of transparency. She would think later about the particular unkindness of learning your biggest secret in a room built entirely out of see-through walls. Bissy Faletti did not soften the delivery. She had decided on the drive-in that softening it would only prolong the pain, the way a nurse learns that a fast bandage pull hurts less than a slow one. She placed the ownership file on the table and said, simply, "Daniel Okonkwo owns Akonta Capital. He has since before the 2023 restructuring. He is the reason this company still exists." Adiz read the document 3 times. Not because she doubted its accuracy. Bissy Faletti was not a woman who brought unverified paperwork into a boardroom, but because some truths require multiple readings before the eyes will agree to let the mind believe them. "Does Tund know?" she asked finally, which was, Bissy Faletti thought privately, a strange first question, and perhaps the most honest one Adiz could have asked, because it revealed exactly what she feared losing first. "No one knows except us and the lawyers," Bissy said, and presumably him. Foreshadow paid off. And here the story reaches back to the wedding, 8 years gone, to NNE Ifoma's warning about hands that lift and hands that strike. Adiz had struck Daniel publicly, at the gala, with careless, casual cruelty, believing she owed him nothing, believing the debt between them had been settled the day the divorce was finalized. She did not know that the debt ran the other way, that Daniel had been, invisibly, the hand that lifted her twice, for 8 silent years, while she told a version of her own story in which she had needed no one's hand at all. She thought of her father, 3 years into his own quiet retirement now, comfortable, his old debts a distant memory he rarely mentioned. She had always believed some unnamed government relief program had saved him. She had never once asked the name of that program, because gratitude, when it comes to family shame, is often easier to leave unexamined. She called her father that afternoon. It was a short, devastating conversation. "Papa," she said, "who paid off the truck loans the year everything almost collapsed." There was a long pause on the line, the pause of an old man deciding, after 8 years of silence, whether a promise of confidentiality still binds a person once the person it protected has begun to unravel anyway. "I signed something," her father said finally. "I was told never to say the name. I am sorry, Ada. I thought it did not matter anymore who it was. I thought you would never need to know." "Whose name, Papa?" Another pause. And then, quietly, the answer that turned a business scandal into something far more personal, far more painful, and far more folktale-shaped than Adiz had allowed herself to imagine in 8 years of telling herself she had built everything alone. "Daniel's," her father said. "It was always Daniel." Adiz did not call ahead. She drove to the small 2-room office in Yaba herself, in the same red dress from the gala the night before, because she had not slept and had not changed, and had not, in truth, stopped moving since the phone call with her father. Daniel's office was exactly as unremarkable as she had mocked it for being the night before. A small reception area, 2 employees who looked up in surprise, a modest back office where Daniel sat with a cup of tea going cold beside a stack of shipping manifests. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, still in yesterday's dress, and something in his chest recognized, before his mind caught up, that the day of reckoning he had spent 3 years quietly avoiding had finally arrived on its own schedule, the way these things always do, not when you're ready, but exactly when you can no longer prevent them. "You knew I'd find out eventually," she said. "It was not a question." "I hoped you wouldn't need to," Daniel said. "That's different from knowing." Why? This was the same question the story had been holding since the beginning, and now, finally, Adiz was the one asking it aloud, standing 3 feet from the man she had humiliated the night before, the man who had, apparently, saved her family's fortune not once but twice, and told no one, not even her. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, he did it the way he answered most things, slowly, and only once, expecting to have to say it just this single time. "My grandmother told a room full of people at our wedding that whoever struck the other down in public would find what they tore down rebuilding itself against them," he said. "I didn't believe in curses. I still don't, not really, but I believed in her. And somewhere in the years after our divorce, I stopped thinking about whether I still loved you, and started thinking about whether I could live with myself if I let your father lose everything, or let your company collapse, when I had the means to prevent it and did nothing. That wasn't about you anymore, Adiz. It was about the kind of man I wanted to be able to look at in a mirror at 50, at 60. I did not do it to be thanked. I certainly didn't do it so you could stand in a ballroom and tell 200 strangers you built it alone. But I also didn't do it hoping you'd say thank you. I did it because it was the only version of myself I could live inside." Adiz sat down, finally, in the small plastic chair across from his desk, the fight going out of her all at once, the way a storm sometimes simply stops instead of tapering off. "I humiliated you," she said, "in front of everyone, and you'd already saved me twice." "3 times if you count last night," Daniel said, and for the first time in the conversation, something almost like a smile crossed his face, tired and without triumph in it. "I could have let Bissy's message sit unanswered. I could have let the lawyers stay quiet. I still have that option, actually. Nobody outside this room and one office of lawyers needs to know any of this became public. The choice that defines the outcome, as the story requires." And here was the moment the entire folktale had been built to reach. Not a confrontation resolved by anger, or by romance rekindled, or even simply by an apology accepted, but by a decision only Daniel could make, about whether the truth he had protected for 8 years should finally be allowed to surface into daylight, where it could either humble Adiz publicly the way she had humbled him, or remain, one final time, a kindness given without demand for acknowledgement. "What do you want to do?" Adiz asked, and for the first time in 8 years she asked it as a genuine question, not a challenge. Daniel looked at the cold tea in front of him for a long moment. "I want," he said finally, "to send Bissy one message, not to expose you, to ask her to keep the file exactly as private as it's always been. The company doesn't need a scandal. Your father doesn't need this dragged into the papers at 70 years old. And I don't need anyone's applause for something I never did for applause in the first place." Micro cliffhanger. "But," he added, setting down the tea, "I do need you to understand one thing before I send that message. And once I say it, Adiz, I don't think either of us gets to pretend the last 8 years happened the way we've been telling ourselves they did. I never stopped believing you were capable of building something enormous," Daniel said. "That was never the argument between us, even when we were married. The argument was that you believed capability and cruelty had to travel together, that ambition meant treating gentleness like a weakness you'd already outgrown. You proved last night in front of 200 people that you still believe that. You used my quietness as evidence of my smallness, in the exact same breath where quietness was the thing keeping your father's name off a foreclosure list and your company off a bankruptcy filing. I'm not telling you this to punish you. I'm telling you because somebody should have told you a long time ago, and I don't think anyone ever has." Adiz did not defend herself. This, more than anything else in the story, marks her turn, the folktale's proof that the lesson has actually landed, rather than simply being heard. A person who has not changed argues. A person beginning to change sits in the silence and lets the accusation stand, because they recognize its shape from the inside. "I built a whole company," she said quietly, "on top of a story where I needed no one. And the truest thing that ever happened to that company is a man I mocked in public, keeping it alive and asking nothing in return. I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," Daniel said. "That's not how debts like this get repaid, Adiz. Not with a speech. Not with an apology at a gala 6 months from now, dressed up as a redemption story for the cameras. If you ever repay it, it'll be in something much smaller and much less visible than that, in how you treat the next quiet person you're tempted to humiliate in front of a room, because you've mistaken their silence for weakness." He sent the message to Bissy Faletti while she sat there. "Keep the file sealed. No public statement. No press. This stays between the 4 of us." Adiz watched him send it and understood, with a clarity that arrived almost like grief, that he was protecting her one final time. In the exact moment she had least done anything to deserve it, and that this, not the money, not the secrecy, not even the wedding day warning finally come true, was the actual lesson the last 8 years had been quietly, patiently building toward. Nothing about Adiz's public life changed after that morning. Swiftrill's 5-year anniversary was still, as far as the business press was concerned, an unqualified triumph. No scandal broke. No headline ever mentioned Akonta Capital Partners, or the quiet man who owned it, or the gala comment that had briefly threatened to unravel 8 years of careful silence. But something smaller changed. The kind of change that never makes headlines and rarely gets noticed by anyone except the person living inside it. Adiz began, in the months that followed, to ask the names of the quiet people around her. The operations manager who had invited Daniel to the gala in the first place. The junior staff whose small, unglamorous reliability she had never once thanked in 8 years of building an empire she called hers alone. She did not become a different person overnight. Folktales are honest about this, even when audiences want a cleaner ending. The old pride did not vanish. It only learned slowly to check itself before it opened its mouth in a crowded room. She called her father again some weeks later, and this time she thanked him, not for the business advice he had given her over the years, but for the version of the story he had, without meaning to, protected her from having to face for 8 years. And once, exactly once, she sent Daniel a message. Not an apology exactly. He had told her correctly that apologies performed for an audience meant nothing, but a private acknowledgement, 4 sentences long, that said everything the story needed said and nothing more. He did not reply immediately. When he did, 3 days later, it was a single line. "I only ever wanted you to build something you didn't need to lie about. Looks like you're starting to." Daniel's consultancy grew a little that year, not because of any hidden hand this time, but because Swiftrail quietly began routing more of its freight contracts through his small firm, on ordinary commercial terms, at ordinary market rates, the way 2 respectful business partners conduct themselves when neither one needs the other to owe them anything anymore. Closing the frame, answering the hook's original question, and so the room that fell silent the night Adiz humiliated her ex-husband in front of 200 strangers never did learn the whole truth of what happened next. Most of them went home believing they had witnessed nothing more than an awkward moment between exes at a gala, forgotten by the following week. Only 4 people ever knew the real shape of the story. A woman who learned, 8 years too late, that the people we call small are often the ones quietly holding up the floor beneath our feet. A man who kept a promise made at his own wedding not because he believed in curses, but because he believed in the kind of man he wanted to remain. An old woman, 3 years gone, whose warning had waited 8 patient years to be proven true. And a father finally free to say a name he had carried in silence, relieved beyond words that the truth, when it finally surfaced, cost his daughter only her pride, and not everything else besides. The hand you lift someone with is remembered longer than the hand you strike them with, even when, for years, only silence is watching. Humility costs nothing until the day pride sends the bill. By then, it is always the ones we underestimated who hold the receipt.